Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Bienvenue, as they say in French. This is a French evening, French-speaking evening at least. And I have the very great, I will shortly have the very great pleasure to introduce our evening's guest, Professor Shmuel Trigano. This is an event that's been organized by the Vidal Sassoon Center, which is an international center for the study of anti-Semitism. Before introducing our guest, I would like to tell you that this is the last but one event of this year, because next week, on June the 16th, we will have our last event of this academic year. We've invited a professor from the University of Rome who has just published a book in English through under our aegis on the protocols of the Sages of Zion. It's Professor Cesare De Michelis, and he's going to come here to Meyersdorf, and he will give a presentation of his book in French, and it will be the non-existent manuscript, a study of the protocols of the Sages of Zion. Now I turn to this evening's event. Shmuel Trigano is a professor at the University of Paris 10 Nanterre. He is a very well-known philosopher who has published many works in political philosophy, history, and also works focusing primarily on Judaism. Last year, he published a book called La démission de la République, the Resignation of the Republic, and I brought a copy with me because I'm going to quote a couple of sentences from it. This book is about the relationship between Jews and Muslims in France, the spin-off of the Intifada, Islamo-progressism, the delegitimacy of France, Europe and the world, multiculturalism, and all of the worrying symptoms of anti-Semitism. I'd just like to quote two sentences from his book, right at the beginning of the book. Shmuel Trigano starts by saying, there is talk again of anti-Semitism in France. It's a strange debate that took place throughout 2002. Where a learned commentator asked themselves whether arson attacks on synagogues, Jewish schools, or attacks on Jews, whether or not these constituted acts of anti-Semitism. And then a number of Jews with a more authoritative voice made themselves heard saying, no, that wasn't anti-Semitism. And they even accused the Jewish community of racism. These two facts should already indicate the surrealistic nature of the situation that France has been experiencing over the last 2 years. And then my second quotation. The President of the Republic, in person, twice in 2002, publicly fanned the flames when talking about anti-Semitism by saying that the Republic was immune to such a phenomenon, and I'd be happy to believe that. I do believe that France is not anti-Semitic, but there is anti-Semitism in France. One cannot but accept that, otherwise I don't know in what country all those attacks could have taken place other than here. I think that these two quotations from Professor Trigano's book are fairly indicative of the ironic style and his rather incisive approach also. I would like to draw attention to his book on the undermining of Israel, a philosophy of Jewish history, which also came out in 2002, where he talks about the demonization of Zionism, the persistence of archaic stereotypes that people thought had vanished. And he says this is a situation that the Jewish world is experiencing as the undermining and overturning of a political and social world that they thought had been established. He talks about the dehumanizing and depoliticizing of Israel. Its situation or status as a victim, the denial of the Jewish people even of after the Shoah, and then he tries to shed light on what's at stake for the Jewish people in terms of politics, strategies, the prophetic vocation, and what he calls, I quote, the return of Jewish history to the history of the Jews. And he explains how worried he is at seeing all of the fissures in the Jewish world and the decline of modern Judaism, and also in the light of the dangers posed by a kind of human rightism, an anti-globalist form, which once again is turning the Jewish people into the pariah of mankind. Shmuel Trigano has always been very active within the French Jewish community. He has and continues to be a driving force behind the College of the Alliance Universelle Israélite College and of Pardes, and as director of the college, or under his directorship, as it were, a book came out about Zionism, which was an anthology of major articles with an introduction by Trigano. And he's talking about things like the original sin of the Arab states. And these are 7 tales that had been forgotten of how the Jews were expelled from certain Arab countries. He's highlighted here the importance, the critical importance of the Jews in the Arab world, in the reality of the Israeli-Arab conflict. And he points out that 600,000 Jews, stripped of all their possessions, were in a situation which can be directly compared with the Palestinians, but the Jewish version, the Jewish situation is one that is practically never talked about, whether in the French media or in the Western media. In the same anthology also has an interpretive essay where he explains what's at stake in the delegitimizing of Zionism. In other words, above all, the status of Jews as a collectivity, as a people. And lastly, I'd like to draw attention to the importance of the work that he's done by setting up the Observateur of the Jewish, or the Observatory of the Jewish World, with all these documents and studies that have been collected and compiled since the beginning of the Second Intifada. Like a number of people here, he very quickly came to understand that what we were dealing with was the appearance of new forms of anti-Semitism. And he's established this observatory, and I think he'll correct me if I'm wrong, because for many, many months in France there was a strange blackout, as he puts it, using the English term, with regard to a large number of anti-Semitic attacks. And these were even strangely denied. Now, the observatory was a response to a discourse which was immensely critical of Israel, which laid the stress on and further heightened the feeling of isolation suffered by the French Jewish community. One couldn't count on the impartiality or objectivity of the French media. It was necessary to take action, which is what Shmuel Trigano did, on the basis of the factual proof, it became possible to explain what had been going on in France since 2000. And since now the Observatory of the Jewish World, Shmuel Trigano in particular, made a major contribution with its studies with such things as a neo-left-wingism and Israel, Islamism or Islam and the Jews and so on. And so it's the most natural thing in the world for me to have asked Shmuel Trigano to come to the Vidal Sassoon Center to talk about these current crises in France at the moment and the reaction of the Jews. Despite the condemnation that is expressed by the French government and the efforts that have been made recently, anti-Semitic poison is continuing to spread in France. The number of attacks on the Jews is continuing to go up. There have been serious attacks even in the last few days. For something like almost 4 years, we've seen this very worrying increase in anti-Semitic attacks in France, with insults, attacks, desecration of cemeteries, arson attacks on synagogues and schools and so on. And what we must have here is a lucid and very objective, austere analysis of what's going on. And I think Shmuel Trigano is really best placed to give us this picture. And so I'm extremely happy that he agreed to address us this evening in Jerusalem.
Merci beaucoup, cher Robert.
Thank you, Robert. I have half an hour, is that correct? And I've been asked to analyze the strategy, so I'm going to do one or the other. Let's see. I think before we start thinking about the situation of French Jewry in the current anti-Semitic situation, we have to look at what's been going on. What's been happening since the winter of 2001 in France? The combination of two movements and of two attitudes is what we have to look at. First of all, let's take the two movements. We have to look at the fact that there are populations here of an Arab-Muslim background. We have to use that term because these populations are partly of an African background and some of them an African of a Muslim background. So there are incidents here that are committed by African or North African background. These populations are not all immigrant ones. They're also, to a large extent, French citizens. So that's the first movement. Now the second movement, there's a wave of anti-Israeli opinion which is very, very powerful, which has engulfed Israeli supporters, which is largely synonymous with the Jewish community. Let's look now at the two attitudes. First of all, a lengthy period of passiveness on the part of the public authorities with regard to these acts, and media silence. And that is why, as you reminded us, together with a group of researchers, we established this Observatory of the Jewish World in order to show the specific events in which the Jews were attacked, because it was amazing. There was no body of information or opinion which reported these attacks, these events. And then there's the denial or rejection of these events, or at least of the anti-Semitic nature of these events, and vice versa, or conversely, the attitude of the Jewish community in terms of racism and communitism. Now, if the Jewish community said that these people were racist, then it meant, and if they weren't racist, then it meant that they were dreaming up these events. They were making them up. And these are known as intercommunitarian or communitarian conflicts, that means that you're denying there's any anti-Semitism, because that means you're assuming there are tensions coming from the Jews as also from the Arab Muslim sector. And that means that the Jews who are the victims, because I certainly haven't seen them attacking mosques or individuals, that then it means that they were responsible for what happened to them. However, as we know perfectly well, this crisis is not an exclusively French one. It's a European one, as also an international one. In Europe, what has happened? Both in terms of public opinion and as far as states are concerned, Europe has been resolutely pro-Palestinians and more generally pro-Arab and against Israel. The Iraq War, which took place during the period under consideration, has imparted a political dimension to a pro-Arab approach. Europe was and still is massively anti-American and pro-Arab. It even thought that it would join shoulders with the Arabs against the American empire. In France in particular, this has been reflected in a combination of this development and the anti-Semitic crisis. For example, the amalgam or the identification of Bush and Sharon in many crowd situations where for the first time since the Second World War one heard people shouting death to the Jews, and an explosion or exploitation in terms of domestic policy of this international dimension. And here I would quote something said by someone who's still a government minister, which I think very striking, that appeared in Nice Matin in March 2002. He's called Jean-Louis Bourlot, and he said, and you'll understand the combination of the international and national dimensions based on anti-Semitism. He said, what is amazing is that the whole community that's come out of immigration utterly and completely supports the French position. And it's on this basis that one can produce or one can take advantage of this new area of Frenchness, which is absolutely wonderful. You can find this on the left with the communists. You can also find this in the ranks of the UOEF, which is an official body referred to or talked to by the government, but actually it's the Muslim Brethren or Brotherhood, and also in the ranks of the SOS racism movement. So what we have here is a combination, a meeting of the minds, if you like, of an international and a French internal aspect, which marginalizes the Jews, who obviously are considered to be the same as Sharon and Bush and so on. And then it reverberates, it has repercussions with regard to the purely domestic anti-Semitic phenomenon. One would think that because people from the Arab world would be in favor of a particular approach here, that there would be support for a national blending. What this does ultimately is to take the Jews and put them in the dock as far as the nation is concerned. And this has increased the anti-Semitic crisis. It's added an international aspect to this crisis, and it's a far more serious, more acute aspect than on the national level. What has happened on the national level, and I don't want to repeat what you all know, there's been talk of Israel, Israeli excesses. Israel has been excluded from certain contexts. Do you think of the Durban conference, Malaysia and so on? Then there is a worldwide lobby, an Arab lobby against Israel, very active, and it's very active in France, where you'd expect a Jewish lobby, but the Arab lobby is particularly active there in the trade unions, even the teachers' trade union, the human rights and so on. Wherever you go in France, you find pro-Palestinian demonstrators, where there are 400 or 500 demonstrators you find grouped around Laila Shahid or Israeli refuseniks and so on. But on a world level, we have also seen the combination of three world tendencies which are making Jewish lives difficult, to put it mildly. So we have here the anti-globalist trend, which considers Israel to be the same as capitalist America, and it sees the Palestinians as the new people who are the new revolutionaries. They're replacing a proletariat that has vanished. These are the new suffering masses. And if you're progressive, you must support the Palestinian. Then you've got the Islamist trend, which is a worldwide trend, and it has worldwide ambitions, and it has revived old images of the Jew as a liar, a falsifier, and so on. And then you've got a more unexpected trend, which is the postmodernist one, where we find many, many, many Jewish and Israeli intellectuals supporting this trend, and they've carried out a frontal attack on the very existence of the State of Israel, the legitimacy of its national identity and its morality. Now, these three trends, and I'm sad to have to say this, see Israel, or the Jewish people, as enemies, theoretical, or enemies of principle, symbolic enemies. And this is what explains the fact that, strangely, the conflict, which pits 5 million people against another 5 million people, has assumed global dimensions, generating a global hysteria based on what is objectively a very restricted conflict. What this means is that on a European and also a global level, there is a real challenge that has appeared with regard to the existence and the legitimacy of the Jewish people. Now, this challenge, it basically involves challenging Israel's right to exist. For the first time in 50 years, one is now hearing in many circles of the elite, whether they're political or intellectual elites, we hear forecasts about the State of Israel disappearing in the future. Or you hear opinions to the effect that the Jewish state has no grounds for existing, and it should give way to the famous model that the PLO has been preaching for the last 10 years, a secular and democratic Palestine. All of these developments, which go far beyond the boundaries or the borders of France, have obviously been accompanied by an ideological dimension which marks the very form of the crisis. And obviously, as Robert has said, the neutralization of the term Anti-Semitism. And here too I have an example which is a really striking one, and I just cannot resist outlining it to you. The Prosecutor General of Montpellier, after the people responsible for trying to set fire to the synagogue in Montpellier had been arrested, he said, this is not an act of anti-Semitism, this is an act of young layabouts who have nothing better to do. A really striking statement. This goes back to presenting anti-Semitism as an act of criticism of Israel. But anti-Zionism denied Israel's right to exist as such. That means that what we're talking about is an ideology based on the idea of extermination, which aims to destroy the only place that Jews can call home. And if it destroys the place, then one can assume that the population will not have a terribly good faith if they oppose such destruction. Now, if you have an objective form of anti-Semitism that's called anti-Zionism, this has been able to be presented as being very moral and very progressive, and the upshot has been a phenomenon which is very difficult to explain. That is to say, separating the struggle against racism from that against Zionism. And this, above all, takes place in left-wing circles. And this has made it possible, for example, to be objectively anti-Semitic in the name of the memory of the Holocaust, but subjectively anti-Zionist, again, based on a memory of the Holocaust, the Shoah. So a discourse criticizing anti-Semitism has been accompanied by objectively anti-Semitic attitudes, which meant that everyone was confused, and I suppose the average Frenchman or Frenchwoman just had absolutely no idea of what was really going on. However, that being the case, another more important fact has taken place, that is, self-criticism with regard to anti-Semitism has just blown up, vanished. And that means that it's been possible to directly say certain things that had become taboo, and certain very archaic images have been able to come out again. And I'll talk about a work that's just been published, which I wouldn't talk about as anti-Semitic anymore, but anti-Jewish. In one of the publications here, written by someone who had an official position in French diplomacy in France, was able to say Judaism is not familiar with the expression of one's fellow man, and the prohibition on killing in the Ten Commandments applies to one's non-Jewish, to one's Jewish fellow man, and not to one's non-Jewish fellow man. And he quoted a whole series of things supposedly from the Bible, whereas in fact Judaism, he was saying, is a really bloodthirsty, cruel religion. And that sort of work is just totally passed over. Today in France, anti-Semitic acts are continuing to take place here and there, all over the place. On Friday evening, I think a new stage was reached and passed because a Jewish child was stabbed when he was going to synagogue, and his lung was punctured, but his life is not in danger. This is a stage that we've gone through because this is the first time that a weapon has been used in an attack on a Jew. One can wonder whether such acts will continue to take place. Now, the public authorities, the government, have in fact reconsidered their position. This is something that has to be taken into account, that since the present government has taken office, the authorities have reconsidered their views, and in statements and policies and so on. That cannot be denied. But the problem is that a government in a democratic country cannot direct civil society in everything it does at all times. So there is something that's needed which it cannot do as a government. What we, however, state is that the legal authorities have not followed suit, because acts or speeches, statements by anti-Semitic individuals are really not punished. They're considered not to be subject to punishment. It's difficult, perhaps, to find ways of imposing penalties, but that's problematic, because if it's possible to say anything you like about Jews without being liable to punishment, then one should come to an end. And of course it's this whole freedom of opinion and freedom of expression issue. Now, after that presentation, how can we analyze this? Structurally speaking, this is not a crisis of circumstances involving what's going on in the Middle East. Very often we hear this idea that if peace were to come about in the Middle East, then all of this would stop. This is completely wrong. I do think it's wrong, and the fact that people say that simply makes things worse, because increasing the responsibility on the part of Sharon, who's responsible for the situation supposedly in France and in Europe, the fact that Jews are considered to be responsible for the attacks that are being made. So it's not a crisis of circumstance, but a crisis of structures involving France for two reasons.
At the European level, through the European reunion, nation states become something active. The idea that existed in the French society and in the Jewish community. Under French tradition, the focus was the state. It was the guiding principle for collective life, and it's based on such principles that the Jewish identity had been tuned. But what happens when principles crumble? What happens when there is such an upheaval? The French model has been fractured, perhaps ruined. I cannot say that yet. So the European level is of paramount importance. But in France there are two movements, one from the top and one from the bottom of the French society, and we can see the occurrence of an Arab Muslim population, recent citizens, not always well integrated, at a time when the French integration model is no longer valid. And the reality is mining the consensus in the French society. What I mean is that the arrival of such a large population in demographic terms is playing havoc with all the frames, all the set principles of the French society. The combination of these two crises also accounts for the fact of the Jewish identity model. This identity model has become crystallized on the morrow of the Second World War, reinforced by the arrival of North African Jews. There the reference was made to a community, to the values of a community, and this idea of the values of a community is based on Jewish people. When one speaks about the Jewish community in a democratic society, this has nothing to do with the Jewish community in the Middle Ages. And this notion of Jewish community had become something quite new. It gave rise to a model called Judaism in the city. Contrary to the model of the Israelites, the Jewish identity became confirmed in the open, in the society at large. This was adjusted to the French Republic logic. Before, there was no place for a community in France. This Jewish community came into being after the war by being a part of the reconstruction of post-war France. It seemed to be something normal or obvious, which would give rise to no problem. But what happened is that within 15 years, the Jewish community looks quite different from what it was. It has become something that runs counter to citizenry against the Republic, an undivided republic. And thus the Jewish identity model has now ceased to exist. We have reached a time where all the landmarks have become erased, and we are at the same time as the period that came after the war. The Jewish community after the war is completely destroyed, which could be expected because it was after the model of the French Republican ideals. So what is the relations between the Jewish community and society have been changed, and the Jewish community was accused of being communitarist. Something who is a communitarist is someone who gets outside of the common law of all the citizens. And this is amazing because the Jews are part and parcel of French society since Napoleon's Sanhedrin and the consistory at the beginning of the 20th century. This is why all Jewish authors and leaders have become the main heroes of the Republic. Today, most opinion leaders who are calling upon the Republic are of Jewish origin, because this structure was the only one likely to protect Jews in a situation which would be hostile. This is a recent discovery. There was a long story about the development of all this, but I'll get back to this in a few minutes. One has to say that this structural problem that the European process or the French process makes to bear here is supported by two political currents. One is a republicanist trend. They would call them communitarist, but they call themselves Democrats, multiculturalist, green, which are political currents which are staunchly opposed to the nation-state and to the central place of the state in France. In Europe, there is a sovereignist current which is against a Europeanist trend. Those who will not give up the sovereignty of a nation-state, and those who are prepared to give that up in a unified Europe. In that framework, the Jews have been accused of being communitarists and also by the Europeanists and the sovereignists. So the place of the Jewish community should be defined well. The Jewish life is not in a vacuum. It is inscribed in a broader context. The most important phenomenon I'd like to come back to is the feeling that the Jews have remained unchanged, whereas the world around them has changed. And one bright morning they wake up to see that they are in a symbolic institutional abyss where there's no adjustment between what they are and their identity and the environment. I think this is not something specific to them, but also to the whole French society. The landscape has changed around the Jewish community, and the Jews become strangers in their own world. They feel abandoned, rejected in the state. They feel a vacuum. There is a social and historical explanation to this. It is not only psychological. A lot has been said about the anxiety of the Jews and their hysteria, but to explain this situation in psychological terms doesn't seem very serious. Indeed, after the war, the French society, for many reasons, had great freedom. The Napoleon iron hand became looser, and this loosening has made it possible for the Jewish identity to flourish, and thus a new form of laicity, open laicity, secularity has developed, a secularity that had more room for religions. This wording, open secularity, is a word given by Latreille after the Second World War, who had seen that there was a new case law in French courts about the religion. In other words, the courts forbade priests to set up a church without having the authorization of their bishop. In other words, the freedom of the priests was forbidden. Thus, it was also forbidden to have ritual butchering without the agreement of the consistory. So in the legislation, there was a privilege for religious institutions. This is what was called the open secularism, and thus secularism gained ground after the Second World War. And now, in the 70s and 80s, we have these new populations arriving in France, coming from immigration, who quickly demand the same privileges. The term citizenship has a different value today. But what is the problem? Their religion has not gone through modernization. It has not reformed. And these people were also strangers to the national French history. French history had been shared by Christians and Jews, so the changes in the groups that constitute French society had been coordinated, which of course doesn't bar crisis, but thus Christians and Jews who wanted to benefit by open secularity, who wanted more assertion, were taken aback on the left-hand side. What I mean to say is that in the game they were called into had to endanger their own vested interests because they came on the same level as the Muslim people, because the problems of Islam are quite different. This is where the dimension of the Republic and of secularity have become central. One thought as France was old-fashioned and could not devise new models, but it was a reaction of fear perhaps, but in sociological terms. we have spoken about politics, but we have the Jews, but also the Jewish symbol that has a life of its own, can do without the Jews. It is enough in itself, quite independently of what Jews may say or think. This is the inheritance of Christianity, perhaps also of Islam. The Jewish symbol has become a symbolic reference of the French political life since the 80s, since Mitterrand, since the uprising of SOS Racism, who saw the Jew as the very incarnation of the stranger, of the immigrant, which was a falsification. The Jewish figure made it possible to sanctify the foreigner in this case being the North African. The whole history since 85 has seen how the situation has been reversed. The Jewish symbol in the beginning was a criterion of excellence. It was a model. Today it has become a criterion of exclusion, whereas the symbol of the immigrant has risen at new heights in the collective imagination. There was a symbolic transfer of the sign of the Jew to the sign of the immigrant. And of course, all the political players understood how interesting it would be for them to play with the Jewish symbol. The Islamists were in the forefront. From the Jewish symbol, the krif has become the Trojan horse of the Muslims. The Jews have this and this, but we also have the right to this and that. But there haven't been 2 centuries of history there. The krif is not an immigrant association. It was born during the resistance, so it's quite different. Then there is something new. This Jewish sign has also become a weapon of minority identities. For example, Dieudonné is a comedian from North Africa who delivered a very violent speech in a broadcast coming up against Israel, the Jews, and stating very anti-Semitic things. Now he's the leader of a European list for the European elections. The list is called Euro-Palestine. I wonder what would have happened if we had a Euro-Israel list. But Euro-Palestine, and this is something quite new, tries to devise a black African identity. Thus, when there is a condemnation of the Jewish community as being fascist, apartheid, it also says the Jews were slave traders. Of course, we could try and see if there have been such examples, probably some people in Bordeaux. But what is the political use Dieudonné does of this? He realized that this was explosive material, and this symbolic force, he has grafted the symbol of a black identity. The Jewish symbol has become a reference independently from the reality of the Jews, of what they think, of what they do. So we have here a dialectic system which can be a totem and taboo system. You have the Jew who is a victim, the Jew of the Shoah, for which you cry and where there is a memory, and the excluded Jew. So there is a totemic Jew, the one you aspire to, who is a source of values, and the Jew that you hate, but they go together. They cannot be separated. And here there is a dialectical system. I wrote a book about the excluded on this dialectic, but it's something new other than the scapegoat. What is being excluded here is the dimension of the Jewish people. The Jewish people is excluded on behalf of the dead of the Shoah, on grounds of the Israelites, not as a Jew. What is important here is the collective dimension, and one can full well understand that Israel crystallizes this dimension, which, by the way, has always been at the heart of anti-Semitism. Before the Jews became citizens, became individuals, Anti-Semitism accused the Jews of still being a people in secret. They are conspiring. The only way of imagining the Jewish people is a system where the Jewish people never had a place to be. And what happens during the Shoah, the Jews who were citizens in all the nations come together with a view of becoming exterminated. Therefore, after the Second World War, when the Jewish community could not discard this conception. On the one hand, you adore the victim. On the other, you exclude the hangman. So what is their reaction going to be? The least we can say is that the Jewish world is extremely partitioned. Postmodernism is seeding destruction. I know you like it in Israel, but it is questionable in historical and current actual times. And there is also a form of failure of Zionism. Zionism wanted to normalize the Jews for them to be accepted by the European nations. But here we have a contradiction. It is Zionism that is excluding the Jews. Jewish institutions could be left out in this new organization. And this is why my friend Manfred Gerstenfeld has called the privatization of the Hasbara, and I'm a living example of this. In France, many individuals and others have published a text to set up associations to explain to public opinion what happened. And if they set up these associations, it means that the other associations could not fill this role given the requirements of the government at the time, because the socialist government then had asked the Jewish institutions to say nothing about the attacks against the Jews. What Nicolas Sarkozy said a few days ago when he came home is true, but he also understood that the Jewish symbol was very useful and could enhance the political gains one could obtain. As you can see, what is at play is not the eternal anti-Semitism. It is not a mere ideology. It is not a psychological configuration. It is first and foremost structural ideas and heavy problems in the French society, in Europe, and in the forms of democracy. You cannot just change things offhand by some trick or by moral considerations. Societal facts cannot just be dismissed in a second. They take time to come into being. And thus there will be a new configuration. The anti-Semitic crisis is a symptom of a new historical and political configuration. This is obvious for Israel, but also for the diaspora Jews. France is a symbol, but it is also a model that exists elsewhere. It might gain ground in the United States. So this is a new strategy defending the existence of the Jews as a collective entity that still has to be invented.
Thank you very much, Shmuel Trigano, for that very detailed analysis. You can see that Shmuel is not only a thinker and a philosopher, but also a sociologist. I'd also like to point out, since you talked about this new configuration, that there's a new book that has just come out that Shmuel Trigano has written together with Emmanuel Halperin. That is The New Clothes of Anti-Semitism in France. In Europe. It's just come out. And since you referred to Dieudonné, I'd just like to say that the publisher is Café Noir, black coffee. I now have the pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague Simcha Epstein, who's a very well-known scholar, researcher, who works with us at the Wistrich International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, who's written a number of works which relate very closely to our topic of this evening. I'd just like to refer to one recent one, the Refusar under occupation, under the occupation, and that's won a major prize in France. Simcha. Once again, our old enemy is back. He's been with us throughout our entire history. Here he is again. And once again, we're taken by surprise. Oh my goodness, how could this have happened? We thought it was all over. Oh my goodness gracious me. Other generations have had exactly the same problem, and other generations in other times, in other continents, in different forms, different arguments have had to face exactly the same problems with intensities different from that facing us today. We have different zones of intensity. But today we are really facing an old problem. There are a number of things I'd like to say based on what Shmuel has presented in such an incisive and profound fashion. First of all, French Jewry this time, and other times too, but French Jews this time have reacted, and the reaction has been intelligent. In many instances it was improvised, it's been strong. In particular, I'd like to draw attention to the reaction of Shmuel himself, who didn't simply as an intellectual reply by writing articles or books, but tried and to a large extent managed to set up teams to initiate a type of collective or group reaction, which is far trickier than individual reaction, where you would have your own reaction and that of the group as well, which you have with the Observatory of the Jewish World, which Robert has referred to in his introduction. And it's a real honor. It's an honor that the Jews of France have reacted en masse, as it were. And there's just a point I'd like to add with regard to this reaction, which is this. All of the institutions in France and in Israel have said this is a situation which is serious. It's very serious. The situation is getting more serious. But not a single red cent was transferred by the government or the Jewish Agency or any other organization involved with anti-Semitism to the groups or organizations undertaking research. You told me how difficult it had been to establish this Observatory of the Jewish World without any support whatsoever, but nevertheless support here in Israel in the last few months has been major. Every single organization which has a congress, Jewish doctors or whatever, makes a dramatic statement about anti-Semitism, but not a single red cent goes to these structures that are organizing reactions and research and so on. Now, there are a few substantive points that I would like to present here, and Shmuel, I'd be very happy to hear your reaction or your point of view with regard to a number of substantive problems. In 68, 69, 70, we saw a very serious series of anti-Jewish events taking place in France and elsewhere too. And I saw people who were on lists of incidents, who drew up lists of incidents, but they're very similar to those today. They're very similar. They may differ in terms of organized or non-organized. It wasn't young people who came from an Arab Muslim background, but the lists are very similar to those today at a higher level of intensity, but not dramatically so. You have lists of synagogues that were burnt. The first one was at Epernay-sur-Seine back in 78, and it said for the first time, this is the first time that a synagogue has been set fire to since. And the question that I'd like to ask you, Shmuel, is this. Don't we have a tendency, for one reason or another, and here I'd just like to give you a suggestion, to forget these lists and to concentrate on the current list as if it had all started with the current list, as if everything started with the Arab-Muslim violence, forgetting the previous waves of incidents, which were incidents that were committed, perpetrated by young Frenchmen. They weren't Arab Muslims, they were French, and then in England they were by English people, in Germany they were by Germans, because these are universal waves. But don't we tend to attach the requisite significance to the current wave or list, but to forget what happened in previous generations? In other words, isn't it more reassuring to think that this time it's the Muslims who are the baddies, because then we can say that the majority will support us or protest, whereas when it's the French responsible for these incidents, and they are doing them, and they will continue to do them, albeit as a minority, but then when it's the French doing them, then it's far more dangerous, because the prospect that implies for the future is far more threatening. Here it's the majority that's starting to become active against the Jews. And then the second point that I would like to emphasize in the form of a question to which I would like you to react is this new notion of anti-Semitism, one that keeps coming up every 10, 15 years. I happen to have found an illustration going back to 1938 in an anti-Semitic journal called Je suis partout, I'm everywhere. There's an article about the new anti-Semitism, and this is there's someone became involved in anti-Semitism in 1938. The left-wingers, the pacifists, the human rightists, who understand that the Jews want war. Well, it's exactly the same thing as today, basically. After the Six-Day War, you saw exactly the same thing. Neo-anti-Semitism, it was called then. So I'd just like to have your point of view on the question as to whether this business of a new anti-Semitism, isn't this just a phenomenon that keeps recurring? Now, my other question concerns the reaction of French Jews, not in terms of its vibrancy, but there's been a vibrant reaction. There have been Jews who've organized. There are Jews who've taken to the streets. There was a major demonstration early on where it was the Jews on their own. It wasn't the Jews and all the anti-racists, but at this point there were the Jews on their own. It's not a question of vibrancy, but I would like to ask a delicate question. And I know it's a complex one, but I can't not ask it. This involves the problem of ideology or the theme that's involved in this reaction. Now, there are things which, although it's nice to have Jews to react, one thinks, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a kind of French Republican reaction where there's amazing amount of love for the French Republic, or where we're proud to say the last demonstration, the flags were all French ones. Well, you know, I've spent a lot of time in demonstrations trying to find French flags at Jewish demonstrations. So for me, I find it really overblown and overdone to try and republicanize the reaction, make the reaction a French one. We understand the reaction. You have to mobilize the whole of society against anti-Semitism. You have to mobilize the whole of France against the danger which is threatening not only us but the whole of the population. But from the Jewish internal point of view, aren't we making a really serious mistake in terms of learning experience, in terms of our internal matters, in terms of the Jews themselves? Indeed, has the time not come to say things to the to the Jews, which we started to say in modern terms at the end of the 19th century, from the 1880 onwards? To say, well, the Jews aren't Republic, or they're not in the Republic, not Republicans. Well, that's obviously, but to say that the Jews aren't even a community, that they're a people. And as the Zionist rhetoric said at the beginning of the 19th century, they said the Jews aren't 1% of the Republic or of the country, they're 100% themselves, with all of the overtones that has, with all of the internal educational importance. You have to tell the Jews what anti-Semitism is, you have to explain what the Jewish condition is to the Jews. And if you look at Canada, some people are talking about emigration to Canada, to the United States. We're all familiar with this strange phenomenon, jumping out of one galut into another one. Has the time not come to explain to the Jews what a galut is? We've already talked about this, Shmuel, I know, so I'm sure you're not surprised at the points that I'm making here about this question. Coming to Israel when there's a conference involving Israel, you must always expect that at some point someone's going to ask this sort of question. And I'm sure you're not at all surprised by this question. So don't you think the time has come to ask this question, which is, and I know you say what's at stake is democracy, what is at stake is the Republic, what is at stake is our conception of society. Well, maybe what's at stake is the Jewish question. For us, it's the Jewish question that is raised here. As it was raised in the past, it's raised today. And if you raise the Jewish question, then there are different replies. Some say you have to stay in the Galut. Some say it's the Republic. Say it's a question of equality. And as 50 years ago, some people say the solution to the Jewish question is for the Jewish people to go back to its homeland, to its home. And that's very striking. Obviously, that means that this will lead to a cracking and a crashing of and rendering of all of the varnish, all of the surface layers. But this is a question which I believe really needs to be asked at this point without hesitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Simcha. It is my great privilege to be able to introduce someone who is very well known in this audience, because he appears quite often on television. I have asked him at the beginning how he wanted me to introduce him. Emmanuel Halperin. He said, journalist, and then he added, born in Uzbekistan. So I'm particularly happy to introduce him as a journalist born in Uzbekistan, since I was myself born in Kazakhstan. He was a neighbor because he's left for France. He has a wonderful French accent, so my accent is British. I'd like to read out a few lines from a remarkable text. This is in France, in Europe, in this country, where Jews have been exterminated, ousted, martyrized. So once again, Jews have been despised, insulted in France, and we can but share the feeling of fear and revolt between this new beginning. This is Le Monde, the Le Monde paper today. Nice. It's a very nice text. The French Republic has also said quite remarkable things. He has said anybody attacking a Jew in France attacks France. It's a beautiful formula that has been echoed by the Prime Minister, the Minister of the Interior. Well, France is certainly not France in 1938. There is a reaction by the public authorities, by the community, by the media, when they are confronted with this sort of phenomenon, such as the attack perpetrated against this young man at the synagogue. But from all this debate, there is one question that arises, and Shmuel hasn't raised this question. He said, should one evacuate the Jews from France? Or from Belgium or the Netherlands, for that matter. I don't think we've reached that point. We haven't reached that point because they don't have to be evacuated. They can go for themselves. They have this possibility. But you must be aware of the fact that they do so. I was very surprised to see, during my last stay in France, that even in circles where the very idea of emigration wasn't an idea that was in good Jewish circles, one was toying with the idea of no longer being in France. People have emigrated to Canada, but there are also many who came to Israel from France. I was told that many Jews are not necessarily considering their aliyah, but they are taking precautions. They are buying property. They are making contacts. So something is happening. It is not a concern, but it's an awareness. A solution has to be found to the Jewish question. And this is not going on analyzing the causes of anti-Semitism, which is something that we've been busy with for centuries and millennia. Alain Finkielkraut has a new explanation for anti-Semitism that you can find in his new book that has been translated into Hebrew. It's fine. But the result is just the same. It remains unchanged because the Jews are the others, or because they are Europe, they are the flesh of our flesh, and because they attack the others, whatever the analysis you undertake, even it is very far-fetched at times, you have an ultimate result. The Jews are being attacked. The synagogues are set on fire. never mosques. I'm not a sociologist, nor am I a historian. I can only give you impressions from a journalist. There is a France-Israel association at the French Parliament with many right-wing deputies. There's not one socialist in this association, which really shows the destruction waged by the left. The leaders of this association are not Jews, but they are French of Jewish origins, which means their father and mother are Jewish, but they are of Jewish origin, they're not Jews. I've seen at the French Parliament, I attended a very interesting meeting where the right of Israel to exist was supported. And the deputy of one of the French arrondissements said, "It's quite strange, you who are controlling the press, how is it that you don't defend Israel any better?" Those are friends of Israel. He was quite naive. And then I went to see a journalist working at Le Point, a magazine in Paris, who writes anti-Israeli articles and gets insults from Jewish readers. She says the Jews are more Jewish than French. But they write to you as French. They are French citizens and they state an opinion which is not yours. And she couldn't understand my argument. What she was saying is that the French were not French. The Jews were not French. There is a book, France, Beware of Losing Your Soul. And the conclusion of this book, based on surveys and sociological research, brought about the conclusion that the Jews are no longer perceived by non-Jews as Jews in France, but as Jews in France. They're considered to be a different community. I don't know if they have truly be viewed as Jews from France. I've also perceived myself as a French, I was a Jew in France, not a Jew belonging to France. I won't tell you about my life. There have been many incidents at school and elsewhere. So this is something that was told to me, so there is nothing new about it. It's a new version of the same. The serious thing is that it causes despair to the French Israelites, the community that existed after the Second World War. It's a new reaction that they cannot understand and dominate. And things are quite different for North African Jews. They see things differently and they can see a solution. And you can be sure my best friends are Israelites. Israelite, as the French say, it's the euphemism for the Jews. Very often they use the worst slogans devised by anti-Semites. They say there is no Jewish people, they say. this seems a natural idea to them, or they will explain those French Israelites. The Israelites have committed the original sin. But I also have some of my best friends who are not Jews, and those I've recently met in Paris scared me. They really scared me because this was something a little new. All of a sudden I perceived something that wasn't hate yet, but was very close to hate. You say Sharon, Sharon's the butcher, so I'm responsible for Sharon. The Jews of France have solidarity with Israel, and when I mentioned the name of Finkelkraut, not Finkelkraut as the French would call him, some of my neighbors just started laughing in a way that could only be interpreted as despise, even hate. And I was struck by the fact that this was something new. He told me, Finkelkraut, that he wasn't really banned from television, but didn't invite him so often. Just to say a few words again about the French Israelites. I was sent to France by the Jewish Agency to speak in synagogues. It was the Lech Lecha parasha. So they sent Israeli intellectuals, 12 Moroccan rabbis from Morocco, and myself. And I had to go in two almost secular synagogues, the one in Copernic and the other large synagogue of the Victoire. In the Copernic synagogue, Rabbi William explained the parasha, the Lech Lecha. He explained that Abraham was the first Ivri, the one who passes. And this was wonderful. And he said from that time on, the Jews wander from one place to another. I swear, this is what he said, because the line after, we have Abraham in the land of Israel. He stayed there for quite a long time, and since then the Jews was passing. So with all due modesty, I said, well, it isn't exactly that. The morning after, I went to the Victoire synagogue. I had to speak after the prayer. The president of the synagogue told me, Mr. Halperin, could you say a few words? I said, no, I come here to make a speech. Because we're a bit embarrassed. We usually give the floor to people who only make religious comments. I said, well, I don't want to impose anything on you, but if you don't want me to be here, I shall go. But then this argued, you have to be very objective. And then I said, I am very sorry, I can only be subjective, which is a fact. And they were red in the face and very embarrassed. And finally, they said, don't call for Aliyah. I just say this because it still exists. So this exists amongst the Jews in France. And there is also another thing that is food for thought. When you stand up in defense of Israel, 90% of the time they are Jews. In the last 4 years, most of the papers trying to justify the view of Israel and not defending for settlements, but just defending Zionism. The number of non-Jewish authors can be counted on the fingers of one hand. So where are all the others, Philippe Solers, Poirot Delpech, and so on? Where are they? Why are they paralyzed? It's a very interesting point. Why? What makes it impossible for these people who speak the truth, who think they are looking for truth and justice like Zola? Why aren't they looking? In the case of Israel, in the case of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, why do they avoid to do this work of justice and truth? It shows that the evil here has gained more ground than we would think. It has gained ground since quite some time. I was a cultural advisor in Paris 20 years ago. I went to a plastic art fair, and there was a large fresco 10 meters by 3 showing Menachem Begin sucking the milk of Hitler, and Sharon would look like a swine there. And I found this quite preposterous. It was the work of a French artist from Iceland whose first wife had been Israeli. So I thought that it might be due to some difference amongst the spouses. The embassy sent 2 protest letters to many French institutions, and 2 months later we said that this was not possible because there is a freedom of expression for the artist. But why did they put this fresco at the very entrance? Why did they put it there? This is the major piece that we want to show to you. You cannot escape it. It meant Zionism is equal to Nazism. So he received a letter 2 months later, but the fresco had been removed. Officially, diplomatically, the answer is no, but they understood that it wasn't possible, so they removed the fresco. All of this is not new. What is happening today is probably due. I'm sorry, I'm not speaking about philosophy or something else. I'm speaking about elections. It's not only the interests of France in the Middle East or traditional interests. It is because we have 5 to 6 million of Muslims in France and about 200,000 French in France. For each electoral constituency, by sheer numbers, the Muslim community will have more weight, will carry more weight than the Jews. Obviously, anyone who wants to become elected, and when you want to be elected in a French constituency, the difference will be decided by 1 or 2%. And if there is no reform in 10 or 20 years from now, you will see deputies committing themselves to pro-Muslim attitude. They will probably not say that they are the heroes of the Jews, but they will probably be able to act in this way. This might be dangerous, even if this is a mere crisis. It is a crisis that will go by. You said they were recurrent phenomena, there are cycles, and each or these crisis in anti-Semitism is not something new, but what Dieudonné said was dangerous. He said they were slave traders and they converted in showbiz and in banking and in terrorism. Of course, mentioning the words of an idiot is perhaps not important, but other people read this and believe it. The editor of Le Monde Diplomatique in the book called La géopolitique du chaos. There were 4 pages about the US and Israel, and this was before the Intifada. There were 2 words that were important in comma. You said Jewish people, and you had the Sahara people and the Corsican people. Why did you put comma for Jewish people? But it's very strange, you should ask. And they said, if you don't put it with inverted commas, you are giving credit to Zionism. So these ideas exist on the right-hand side, but also on the left. All those slogans, all these old struggles that exist for ages. Before there were 40,000 Jews and 400,000 today. Can they be dissolved in the Republic? I don't think that is possible. So it is no longer a matter of evacuating them, but a process of repatriation, that is to say the Zionist solution. Thank you. Thank you very much, Emmanuel.
I must say, for a journalist born in Kazakhstan, you are incredibly familiar with France. In any case, before giving the floor to Shmuel Trigano to respond, and then we'll open the discussion to the floor, I'd just like very briefly to add 2 or 3 points that I'd like you to take into consideration. If we start with this really worrying question about the large Arab Muslim population in France, 6 million, with their demography developing at vast speed, I suppose that the question facing the French Jewish community, and I've heard this now, I hear this myself because I have family in Paris and I talk to young people, and above all with the young people, you really have the feeling for the first time in years, at least I feel this, that they are very personally concerned for and about their future and the future of their children, and it's above all because of this question that they see that their community, that is to say the Jewish community, is demographically declining, which is inevitable given mixed marriages and so on. But on the other hand, there's also the weight, as Emmanuel indicated, of electoral questions, which is a major issue that will become increasingly more and more important. And so it's a domestic issue in French politics as well, and this is linked to the whole issue of the idea that the Middle East situation is really not going to be resolved. So this is a state of affairs where basically there's a feeling that for the Jews of France, they've come to a crossroads or a turning point. And then, second issue, this France that you've described, Shmuel, in fairly black terms, I would say, is that, you know, the is the French Republican model cracking, or you've said that you feel it is. The question is whether this France that we knew in historical terms, with its ability, its great massive power to assimilate all comers, is it no longer capable of doing this assimilation and integrating and assimilating these new populations? Can it not even properly assume its own national identity? The values that have been assumed and accepted by the Jews, even with love in France. There certainly was a time where that was the case. There are Jews who believe in this. But is it now becoming just a figment of the imagination? Is it over? That's what I'm asking. Is there something that really has come to an end, finished? And then there's a last point, which concerns Europe. What I'm wondering is this. When you look at this new Europe, which is expanding, not only do people refer to the possibility of a European federal state or a power which one day could counterbalance the United States, but I'm wondering whether it is really a coincidence that at the very moment that Europe is becoming ever larger, that this European identity, even if it's somewhat a figment of the imagination, is starting to really consolidate and crystallize out, that it's at this precise moment that anti-Semitism is flaring up. Because it's always in the modern era that people analyzed and thought of anti-Semitism in the national framework, whereas now in France, as also elsewhere in Europe, people are confronted by a new phenomenon. And there's this Europe which is trying to identify itself somewhat in contradistinction to America, but also in contradistinction to Israel, which is increasingly representing an object of this irrational hatred that Emmanuel referred to, that we're all aware of. Is it perhaps not mere coincidence? And that would be, if that is the case, be even more worrying for the future of the Jews, not just in France but in Europe generally, which would be a really major paradox, because we'd always imagined that the best of all worlds for the Jews would specifically be a unified, democratically unified continent which would be pluralist and multicultural and so on. And what we're actually seeing is really something of the opposite. Well, there are so many questions, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to reply to all of them. It's true, I really do believe that we are either at a crossroads or at a turning point. I have no doubt whatsoever that that's the case. I'd like to report to you on the opinion of a friend who's an intellectual and not Jewish, and he said, look, you're talking about the Republic, you're talking about citizenship, nation, but they don't exist anymore. You're the only people who believe in them. Well, I think I can say it's not just the Jewish community which has had this feeling, but indeed Jews have only been able to call upon the French Republic to save them. I don't think that that will help. They've come from a certain feeling. They've always, to a large extent, been the major advocates of the Republic. I think that the priest is the priest or the advocate. The priest may encounter the sacred, but he's also terrifying insofar as the sacred communicates aspects of the taboo and the profane. So there is a certain amount of ambiguity here, and it seems that certain, what Emmanuel Halperin has called the Israelites, certain Israelites are now assuming the robes of the high priest. So what we're really finding is that in practical terms the model of quote-unquote assimilation or integration has really broken down. and that the very model of national identity is indeed also having its difficult moments. Personally speaking, I've always felt myself a Jew of France in France. I was lucky enough to be born after World War II in the same year as the State of Israel, and I was born in Algeria. In other words, outside metropolitan France, or the metropolis as it was called at the time. Hence, I feel absolutely no debt whatsoever towards France, as like some of the people that you refer to. I feel myself to be a fish in water, not out of it. But having said that, what has struck me on the basis of my own personal experience is that the dimension of the Jewish people is a historical datum or fact that cannot be denied. It's a historical fact. In all of my research and studies, because my problem was to understand what was going on, so for 20 years I've been asking myself, what is going on? I must say, I've reached the conclusion that political modernity has left no room whatsoever for the Jewish people, which meant ultimately it was condemned to destruction. And that's what happened in the Shoah. But individuals was a little different. But the fate of individuals, as we saw in the Shoah, was overtaken by what happened to the collectivity. Now, this was no longer possible after World War II, and it was necessary to note the fact, record the fact, and this is how I explain the disappearance of the ideal of a community. It was the fundamental condition for restoring Jews in democracy and their return to French citizenship. Now, this has taken place in one way or the other, but today it's no longer possible. That is the issue, really, and we must be quite clear about that. When I hear Theo Klein, former CRIF president, makes the speech that he makes, then I have to say I just throw up my hands. He was the head of a community, and he's making anti-communitarist speeches. He's very Israelite, very Hebrew, if you like. Leaders of public opinion, well, he's Israeli as well. He says it everywhere. He says he's Israeli, he has 2 passports and everywhere. First of all, he had the effrontery to be president of CRIF as an Israeli, and secondly, he had the effrontery to be against Zionism and Israel and the community on behalf of the community. And look what he's doing. Now he's talking to the media. It's dreadful. Anything goes. People have no historical, no communal hearing. It's just the world of sound bites. It's a media frenzy that's taken over entirely. So the Second World War was really a failure as far as citizenship was concerned. It was a failure in terms of citizenship, which was subsequently restored. The few months in 2001 that took place were absolutely dreadful for the citizenship of the Jews, because they felt themselves abandoned by the authorities. And this was a very, very strong feeling as a Jew coming from North Africa. I have to say, it reminds me of the last days of French Algeria, when you had to pack a suitcase and leave in 2 days so that you wouldn't be murdered. It's this feeling, this painful memory that came back to the minds of all of the Jews who came from North Africa. I have an Ashkenazi psychiatrist friend, and she's over 90 now, and she said it reminded her of the 30s. Now, I'm not a historian, I can't remember it like that, but it's this feeling of being utterly abandoned, neglected, no one you could turn to on any level anymore. Well, perhaps that was an exaggerated feeling, but it was a very realistic one, and people remain with that very, very strong emotion, so they've lost confidence. They no longer have any confidence or trust in the future or anything they can really identify with and count on. Today, in French Jewry, or among French Jewry, there is an attempt to restore the Israelite image. It's something that's it's true to bear Israel, community, communitarism, anti-Semitism. It's very difficult to deal with all of that, and people really would far rather not have to deal with all of this. For the Jews who are not going to leave or don't find any other solution, I don't know. But one can imagine that there will be a major tendency towards assimilation along these lines, because pressure from society is so strong that weaker individuals, or ones who have no knowledge, who were just Jewish because they were born Jewish and so on, basically will finally will finish up not having any more reason to want to feel Jewish. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the phenomenon of ghettoization. For example, there's the fact that many pupils in the public schooling system, both pupils and teachers are now applying to Jewish schools because they feel insecure in the public education system. I'm saying this is ghettoization because a Jewish school used to be a choice, not a necessity. This ghettoization phenomenon that people are really increasingly turning towards is a very dangerous phenomenon. It means that the Jewish community is becoming confined of its own free will. Another example, the Jews are currently saying, where can we find a pen or a voice which isn't Jewish in order to state to or voice to the public opinion what we want them to say in a way that won't exclude us. So there's nothing worse for an intellectual, myself, saying, if people say, well, the best thing is because you're a Jew, we understand that you support Israel and so on, because you're Jewish. In other words, one's intellectual analytical abilities are just denied because of one's origin. This is a very real phenomenon that's taking place on this level. Or take professional settings where Jews are asked, well, what about your Sharon or your tanks? In other words, that you're being asked to state formally that you are against Israel in order for people to carry on mixing with you or having anything to do with you. There are lots and lots of Jews who now say that they don't mix with or they don't meet their non-Jewish friends anymore in order to avoid disagreements and arguments. So in other words, they're only now really having contacts with their Jewish friends. Well, it's another ghettoization phenomenon. This is very new because post-war identity involved people wanting to be part of citizenship. They wanted to be part of the whole of society. One used to think of the Jews as the intelligentsia, the cultured people and so on, precisely because they were part of general culture and general society. And now this is something that's really being very seriously jeopardized. The question about Europe is an interesting one. Is this process of expanding Europe leading to a flare-up or a greater flare-up of anti-Semitism? If you look at every single turning point in Europe, then the Jewish question crops up again. Well, if you look at the Founding Act, the Protestants retranslated the Bible the Torah from Hebrew, and they created a new anti-Semitism in so doing, with the appearance of modernity again. I think we're going through a period of mutation of this kind. One has to understand the Western system of the Jewish sign, as I've called it. There are Jewish roots. And I would say, and I've written a book about this, that this is a Jewish invention, because Paul is a Jew. Paul comes out of Judaism. There may perhaps be an intra-Jewish problem that is situated within a wider problem, and that's something we have to confront. But the fact is that today, and in fact we are seeing a flare-up of archaic Christian terms, along to do ultra-secular philosophers, anti-religious people are writing about Paul now, and they keep coming up with this discourse on Jewish particularism and communitarism compared with the Catholic universalist tradition and so on. They're not Christian, they're post-Christian, they're anti-religious, but, for example, Alain Badiou makes Paul into the first militant of history, the first Trotskyist of history, and this in fact is a Yiddish expression defining Paul as the first Trotskyist. Very funny. One can have the feeling that the resurgence of Europe is re-finding the Jewish question which was there when it was symbolically constituted originally. The Jews are there before they speak, so they are experiencing this discourse which is against them without them having any ability to do anything whatsoever about it. Some of them are now starting to affirm themselves as Jews. But I think it seems to me that you're forgetting that the state of Israel is no longer what it used to be, and that Zionism is no longer what it used to be, because what comes to us from Israel in France exclusively left the anti-nationalist discourse or the extreme left-wing historians. So if we get involved in a controversy, then what are you saying to us? They say, the Israelis are saying this. If the Israelis are saying this, then it must be true. So that means that Israel has to solve its own problems before thinking about solving those of the Jews. That means, therefore, that there is a problem on this level. The situation is utterly different from that of the 60s and the 70s. No, I'm not saying it. I'm not making the point in that way. I record this, I note this as a fact of life. It's a calamity, really. Sorry, comments from the floor without being in, which aren't spoken into a microphone and not audible to the interpreters and therefore cannot be interpreted, and we do apologize. Well, here we're talking about a symbolic stage, if you like. On this symbolic stage, you have a whole host of Israelis who come along and they undermine Israel's image. But they say they are introduced as, or they claim to be academics. But you're talking here about discoveries. Are you talking about discoveries in archives and so on? Who would suspect that behind these texts there's also an ideological aspect? Nobody, because people are not familiar with history. There's total amnesia when it comes to history. People who are 55 plus, like myself, they've gone through a whole development, but younger people don't know anything about this. It's all terra incognita as far as they're concerned. So the French Jews are saying, well, what is going on in Israel? It's odd, it's not our Israel, the one we hoped for. But the people have gone astray as far as Israel and the Israeli image is concerned. It's not of the same strength as happened with the Six-Day War, but you have to take that on board and remember this. Here in Israel, this is completely drowned in society and culture. It's infinitesimally small, but imagine that what comes to France from Israel, perhaps out of wickedness or ignorance, you find that this dimension I'm talking about is presented in an oversized fashion. Israel's original sin, its bad establishment in a situation of apartheid and exclusion and ethnic cleansing and all of that sort of thing, that gains credit, major credit, in a discourse which claims to be universalist and scholarly. And there's the Azon publishing house run by someone originally Jewish, which publishes or sets out to publish all of the works of the so-called new historians, new archaeologists, new sociologists, and so on. So you have to take account of this, and it doesn't mean to say that the Zionist idea is at work here. You just bear that in mind. I wanted to give you an analysis that comes out of the idea of moral outrage or ideological discourse, showing that the reality of things ultimately means, well, you should believe in people, but above all, it's sociological facts involved. Now, sociological facts, as I've shown you, is developing in a negative way. It's not a good development, and clearly we're going towards problems which already exist. The question is whether Jews who stay in France, what kind of new form of identity they will assume, because that's the only possibility. People have to adjust themselves to the situation. If they leave, then that's a whole different tale that will start. Some people are tempted to re-establish Franco-Judaism, and I'm sorry, Alain Finkielkraut wrote a text in Le Monde, and one gets the feeling that was replied to by Serge Klausfeld in a very radical fashion, who said that France doesn't need the Jews and the Jews don't need France. This is a response or an answer which also raises problems. Also, there's an attempt to restore Franco-Judaism or Jewry as the soul of France, but it would be a victimized soul and a suffering soul. But there are efforts being made on that level. So why do intellectuals not respond? Well, I think it's because this idea of Israel's original sin, authenticated by historical proof, has to some extent paralyzed reactions insofar as these people no longer feel themselves morally underpinned, because we're talking about a major moral conscience, as everyone is known, to defend Israel. And I must say, very, very few people. Well, I'd like here to talk about Professor Eric Marty from Paris 7 University, who's really absolutely remarkable, who is the butt of major criticism by his colleagues, and he's written several articles in the Temps Moderne. But the intellectuals, the majority of intellectuals, are just silent. One doesn't hear them on this level. And you must remember what Jean-Paul Sartre said in Reflections on the Jewish Question, that wasn't quite understood properly, generally speaking. He said the Jews have two enemies, the anti-Semite and the Democrat. The anti-Semite wants to destroy the man in him to leave only the Jew and the pariah. The Democrat wants to destroy the Jew in him and leaving only the man. And I believe, I don't know whether Sartre thought through to the end the really gravity of his thought. He said anti-Semitism exists only in the Republic, which is the most sweeping statement, but no one really thought about it properly. No one noticed it. But here we come to the very heart of the contradiction of modernity with regard to Jewish fate. And this is indeed a question which goes beyond France, and which I think is a very, very marked one. If Israel exists, it's precisely because it's the upshot of this impasse in modernity. I don't know what the Jews of France will do. The original idea perhaps has been dropped. It doesn't mean to say that they're going to leave, but they think about things after Madrid, or the reactions after the elimination of Sheikh Hussein. Well, there were all sorts of reactions there. I think it's a very, very bad sign as to the reactions at that point. Electoralism is very, very present. It's major. When Jacques Chirac campaigns as candidate, he addresses French citizens of North African origin from Oran and Tangiers. Imagine if he were to address French Jews from Jerusalem, when he hasn't done that, because I'm sure there would be a terrible outcry. But he's done everything he can to get himself admired by the electorate coming from North Africa, and there's an awful lot of campaigning of a very vulgar nature on both sides. The forecast as to demographic developments is a real problem for France and for the whole of Europe indeed. One can imagine what will happen here, and you're right in your thoughts here. But I would say that there nevertheless is, well, how can I put this? The Jews wondering, and it's difficult to say this, they're wondering whether they can have trust in their fellow citizens of Muslim or Arab background. Imagine a Jew comes across someone who's an office holder from that background. I'm not sure that he'd be impartial. What I'm sure is that when a Jew deals with a Jew, then he's sure that he'll be ripped off, precisely because the Jew wants to show that he's utterly independent. But as for the opposite, I must say I really have my worries here. And this is a doubt that is really starting to build up among citizens. And you can only eliminate that doubt if you have a kind of national pact, some new undertaking of integration to establish a new identity. And here the state is really anemic, very wishy-washy in this sense. It's the only way to approach things, I think, but that would assume that you have a strong leader, a leader who has sufficient charisma and sufficient stature to impose such a solution. So as for the extreme, the far right, just one brief comment. Its importance in the current situation has really been played down. We have a researcher working on this in our observatory, and the link between the far right and Islamist or extreme left-wing movements having lies that are dreamt up and sent this way and that way. Those links have been totally ignored. They're certainly not missing from the current picture, but others do their work for them. All they do is throw firebombs of a symbolic and force information into the situation, and very often naive Jews swallow this or hook, line and sinker. Now, just last thing, in my own experience, I know what happened after the Six-Day War and the globalist hostility to Israel. I know the Third World approach. Hostility, what we've gone through in the last 3-4 years is totally different, because at the time the image of Israel was a very healthy one, a very strong one. It was the Israel of kibbutz socialism. It was the people fighting the elements. There was a very positive image of Israel and a positive impact in French society, despite the anti-Israeli propaganda of the far left and the third worlders. But now there are major sectors which seem to be involved here in this anti-approach. It's not just the extreme left. Everyone seems to be generally pro-Palestinian. If you had you only see images of children and women in terrible circumstances. It's the Palestinians, obviously, never the Israelis, that are shown now. Israelis really have a terrible press. And what is currently happening is that this dimension of legitimacy and morality of post-war Jewish existence has been totally undermined. All of the Jewish institutions have been created in the post-war period. So this is a really new situation. There's this feeling of adversity. Personally speaking, I've never experienced this in French society, even in very difficult times like the 70s, the Six-Day War, and so on. You're right about the 70s. It's true that there was this dimension then. The Rue Copernic attack does represent a turning point, and it happened at the same time as the Lebanese war, and you could feel French opinion changing at that time. There was a beginning of an opening towards Judaism, something exotic, but as of that point it became something that was problematic. And the first real anti-Semitic acts started with the first Gulf War. There were acts that occurred then, and after the second Intifada and the second Gulf War, or the Iraq War, we have this really major wave now. But what has been going on over the last 3 years is very, very different from what we've experienced in the past, and that's the only thing I can say here.
We can take 3 questions. I hope those questions will be short and accurate. I take one on each side. Thank you for this speech. My question, there is one point that links us in a difficult way, in a painful way. How do you read this phenomenon of self-negation, both on the part of the French community and the Israeli citizenship? What would be the stakes? What is it due to? Why does it come up with such violence today? My question has to do with the French authorities since the beginning of the Intifada to this day. Clearly, as you have said, Mr. Halperin, that there was a silence, that there was an abandonment by the authorities, which was one of and one of the reasons of this was campaigning electoralism. And a Jew told me clearly Jospin has lost the elections when he bet on the Palestinians. But there is one factor that you have not mentioned, I think. I think it is the fear of violence and even of terrorism. So the silence. Recently, we have seen the French reconsider their views. The President, the Prime Minister have become completely open at television. Everybody discusses anti-Semitism, condemns anti-Semitism, who attacks the Jews, attacks France. But I am not clear on the reasons of this. I have an idea about American Jews but once the electoral factor has disappeared, could you throw some light on this? It's an hypothesis I want to share with you. I think you already mentioned it. In fact, anti-Semitism, whether old anti-Semitism, new anti-Semitism, international anti-Semitism, or otherwise, is the common denominator not only at the crossroads of all the ideological currents that have brought into being French trends. Where we arrive at individual values, and where many things seem to be anachronistic or seem to belong to a bygone era of nationalism. Are we not witnessing a change in the trends? Emmanuel Halperin has been quoting from the article in Le Monde, where you see a change in the radical left in France. In France, the magazine Mouvement has devoted a file to Zionism, which came against the Palestinian view of Zionism. So, what do you think of this development? What we'll do now is first ask each of our three participants very short answers, 2-3 minutes. Emmanuel? I don't think I'm competent to speak on those 2-3 questions. I really don't know. I would like to read another excerpt of an interesting text. Somebody is speaking of the absolute right of Israel to live in the region. This is not a demand only on the basis of international law, because it has provided legitimacy to Israel. It is the unchallenged recognition of the right of the Jewish people to a state after so many centuries of dispersion and misery. Already in June 1917, Jules Cambon the Quai d'Orsay was expressing, even before the Balfour Declaration, the sympathy of the French government for the revival of the Jewish nation coming back to its cradle. And this is what Jacques Chirac said at a dinner party where he was hosting President Katsav. This is very interesting because after a very long period when it was absolutely impossible to get a sentence of this nature from a French representative, not only the right to exist of Israel, but the right for the Jewish people to exist. But a quotation from Jules Cambon's letter, where they're speaking of Jewish nation. Finally, the President of the Republic, on this very solemn occasion, has said that Zionism was a normal, legitimate, and just thing. This was not noticed. I didn't see anything on this in the press. I looked at all that was written about President Katsav's visit. I noticed this because Mr. Villepin came to Israel, and the French ambassador, Mr. Hunzinger, I said, what should I say to please the Israelis? Tell them this. And I sent him the Jules Cambon's letter, which I found in Yohanan Manor's book. Well, this is the Jewish lobby, you know. The ambassador has heartily thanked me. He didn't know this letter of Cambon, and obviously he had suggested this text to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who came here and who mentioned nothing of this sort. He repeated the fact that we are in favor of the right of Israel to exist. He wasn't mentioning the natural right of the Israeli people. We had to wait for Chirac's speech, and there is a development here, there is a shift here. There is a reaction on the part of the public authorities who affirm their determination to fight anti-Semitism and the will to deny the legitimacy of Israel at the highest level, that is to say, the President of the Republic. I wanted to mention this because this is very positive. The point I'm raising in one sentence, with Zionism, the problem is not only but also the recognition of the legitimacy of Zionism amongst the non-Jews, but also the recognition of Zionism by the Jews. There is a problem that is not only our problem with non-Jews. At a certain moment, the Jewish community understands that it stands for itself. It will not depend on the words of any given journalist. It depends on the manner in which it conceives about its origin, its belonging, its future. This is the moment that comes to be in history. One doesn't know when this precisely occurs in a given continent, and immediately the debate becomes a purely Jewish debate. At this time, we don't really mind about what a given authority will say. The problem is not because somebody has to prevent the arson of a synagogue. Here the debate is an internal debate to the Jews. What are we? This is the true debate for the Jews. that would call for another symposium. In fact, I quite agree with what you just said. In the course of these 30 days, I have supported this line because I run the risk of being misunderstood, because I thought that the Jews did exist. But I discovered that this was a scandal for the Jews. And very often I've been marginalized because of this hypothesis, which is essential in any strategic analysis. But today, a negation of oneself is a sign of the poor shape in which the Jewish condition is. I don't like this expression, self-hate. This is something that belongs to the 30s, but it reflects some of the elements of the current situation, but it is a deep-going syndrome. Again, I've finished a book about this because it is my only way to think about matters. And there is another book that we are working on within the Observatoire, trying to hear what those Jews have to say. There are scientists, academics, intellectuals, and it's interesting to listen to them when we compare this to their methods and their scientific criteria. But I cannot give you a full answer on this here and there. But what I fear, God forbid, the Jews no longer agree on what it means to be together. There may be schisms here. I hope they will not occur. This logic is commonplace, and we don't know what it will bring about. The attitude of the French government, how can we explain it's done about? I don't know about the ruling circles. I think there has been a change because it's counterproductive in terms of elections. What the demonstrations that have been mentioned in Israel have not been relayed by the press. The CRIF had to publish speeches because the press said nothing about them. As to the evolution of Le Monde as a paper is responsible for this trend. It has never changed its opinion. I'm not really impressed when I read what I read. But let us not forget that in the ideology there has been a sharing, a division. One is against Israel and also against anti-Semitism. At the same time that you defend the Shoah, you attack the Jews. It's a dialectic relationship. People who say it's an outcry to stab a Jew and burn synagogues are the same who will say Israel is a fascist state and so on. So one has to understand this dialectic division, which is very difficult to understand in rational terms. I think this is what we could say. I hope that there is an awareness in the authorities, and there is the influence also of the Americans, which tarnishes the image of France. This has an impact. The former French ambassador in Israel has become the ambassador of memory. He provided the information on what happened to safeguard the memory of the Shoah. The government understood that there was failing communication at this level, so the intention was a programmed restoration of the image of France, and we couldn't complain about that.
Well, since reference has been made to the different attitude on the part of the government, I'd just like to give you an example before I close the evening's proceedings. The French ambassador in Israel, great hope. Everyone must take note of what I'm about to say. So the French ambassador in Israel asked to come to our center, our International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, next week. He made the request. This is yet another sign. Obviously, it's not going to resolve any problem, but it does mean that, nevertheless, it is an indication. It would have been unthinkable a year, 2, 3 years ago. We've had the most fascinating discussion. It remains only for me to thank Shmuel Trigano, first of all, for his outstanding presentation. I'd like to thank our two respondents, Emmanuel Halperin and Simcha Epstein. And I'd also, above all, like to thank our team from the Centre, who, as usual, have done the most wonderful job of organizing this evening, and I thank them. And I'd also like to thank everyone who has stuck it out to the end, 2¼ hours, and that's absolutely wonderful. For whatever reason, I went out and I said to Haggai that we were really suffering.
I told him, but he couldn't care less. I asked him how much does it cost. He said